So I'm sure you've all been in a position where, whether it's with your children or a spouse or a coworker, where you've tried to convince them to do something. Tried to convince them to do something different even. And maybe that first time, second time didn't work. And so then a lot of times what we do, right, is we then use ourselves as an example. We say, well, here's what I did, or here's my testimony, or here's how this thing worked in my life. And we present ourselves to the person or the people that we're trying to get to do something in a different way or to change how they're doing something. Well, in chapters 8, 9, and 10, which all go together, by the way, Paul is trying to convince a certain group of people in this Corinthian church to stop going to the pagan temple. Right? He already said earlier, right, when we were looking at different behaviors, like stop the whole prostitution thing, stop going and engaging in that. But then what we saw last week, right, is Paul engaged that topic with the knowledgeable. We guess these knowledgeable are the ones that are struggling with Paul, and then we guess also these knowledgeable ones are the ones that might be a little more wealthy. Because they've exchanged a couple of letters already. Well, actually, Paul shows up, plants the church, right, and says, stop going to the pagan temple. And then they write back and say, hey, we don't think there's a problem with that. He writes back again and says, we think there is. And now he's answering another letter about this. And if you recall last week, they said, look, we know there's no such thing as idols. And what? What did I say?
No such thing as
idols.
Oh,
no such thing. Well, I love the participation. At any moment, you are free to stop me and say, we have zero idea what the heck you are saying. Okay? No such thing as idols. And, wow. And we know there is only one God. Is that better? Okay. The front row needs me to slow down. Okay. And so Paul is replying back to this, okay? And he doesn't say, like, you're wrong with what you're thinking. He's saying the problem is you're taking people who aren't knowledgeable like you, who might just be new followers of Jesus, and you're turning them backwards possibly. Right? And he says, so stop doing it because the body matters. And so what might be good for you because you're knowledgeable might not be good for the entire body. And so what we said last week, where we ended this, right? Yes, as we said, Paul started that section by saying love builds up. Love for one another builds the body. And as he's walking through this, he says your behavior makes a difference in the lives of other people. Your behavior matters. And so when you take a weaker brother, someone with a weaker conscience, right, which we said is someone who doesn't know any better, then the chances they might get back on the path they were on before they found Jesus. Okay, now it would seem like this would be enough for this conversation. But then he goes on for a bunch more sentences, and then next week a bunch more to drive this point home. But I want to take a step back because Paul uses a phrase, and it came up in my meeting Tuesday, and then Betsy and I were talking through this a little bit on later on Tuesday, is Paul uses this phrase, slave to all. And we can read that and say, okay, we get what slave to all means, but it means something significant in that culture. And so I want to bring it back to kind of review what's going on in that culture. But remember, humility is not a virtue in the Greco-Roman culture. Lowering your status is not something you do. Okay, so if I'm at this class level, to drop myself down to another class for any individual is not something you do. Okay? It's not normal, and this is one of the reasons the knowledgeable ones in Corinth are struggling with Paul, is because apparently he's lowered himself. Now, let's talk about Paul a minute. Paul is a Pharisee who is a Roman citizen who appears to be well educated. We would gather that Paul is in some sort of upper class. Okay? That matters as we get ready to look at his words and what he's suggesting. Okay? So we would have this idea that he's up here, not down here. Okay. So let's look at a couple of different types of leaders in the Greco-Roman world. There was one that was called a benevolent patriarch. And so I want you to get what this is saying, okay? They led compassionately and thoughtfully. They're recorded that way, from a position, though, of authority, while never betraying their superior status or compromising their power. I want you to hear that. They're looked at as compassionate and thoughtful, but they are never going to betray their higher class. They were noble-born, exhibited a lifestyle of means, maintained their social hierarchy, they avoided manual labor or the appearance of servitude, and they enjoyed the best education. Okay, so there's this group of leaders that are compassionately, thoughtfully looking out for people, but they will never lower their class level to understand the needs of a certain class. Do you get it? They will always stay up here. Their social dynamics are up here. Manual labor, that's for another class, right? We don't do that. Servitude, not a chance. You get it, right? Okay. Well, there's another group, not that there aren't others, but there's another group that get called demagogues or a populist leader. They portray themselves in a lower position as a servant. And they were actually praised for considering the needs or desires of the people. Sounds really good, doesn't it? So this is a group of people who are willing to lower themselves to serve other people to get followers. Let's understand their ultimate goal. Their goal is still to get followers. Their goal is still to build a following of people. So they can never, you have to guess, these aren't people of an upper class. These would be mid-class to lower-class people who are trying to build a following by serving. Okay? Philo. You've heard of Philo, the Jewish philosopher? Here's what he writes about populist leaders. Philo accuses the populist leaders or the demagogues of voluntarily lowering themselves for their own good or the good of the poor masses rather than the common good. So Philo says they're lowering themselves because they get something out of it, and the only people they care about are the poor people that they're trying to get a following of. They don't care about everybody. In other words, Philo says, these leaders fail to consider the good of the rich or the good of the whole. Since they must keep the masses content to maintain their power, populist leaders are usually characterized as slaves to the ever-changing will of the people. Okay? So they were looked at as, okay, they're taking on this servitude, so the upper class is saying they're just becoming slaves. They've become people pleasers to whatever people want. They've just become a slave to the mass, to the people, because they want the following. Okay, so do we get the two different types here? Okay, and so Paul then begins this discussion using himself now as an example. By the way, it'll end in chapter 11, verse 1, when he finally just says, imitate me. Okay? I'm following Jesus, imitating Jesus. You need to imitate me. But here he begins this long discussion, and we'll read through it, this long discussion of why he's not accepting money. This long discussion of why he's becoming a slave to all. And then he uses this amazing sports metaphor, which there was a big sporting games that took place in Corinth. What was it? Isthmus Games or something like this? Yeah, that took place in Corinth. And so the Corinthians understood sports. Okay? So they get what he's trying to say here. Okay? So they get that at the end. All right. So let's take a look. And so as I'm trying to figure out, like, what do we call this? Really what I see in this, and this word gets translated as purposeful. What is my purpose? Paul's purpose is the gospel. Paul's purpose is the good news. And he's trying to communicate this message to the Corinthians that the purpose isn't being able to go and socialize with who I want to socialize with. It isn't going to the temple, even though I know it's okay for me to go, to eat and have a feast with my buddies. No. What matters is the community and the gospel. And I need to have purpose in proclaiming that. Okay. I'll be reading out of the New Living this morning. By the way, Paul asks, I think, 5 rhetorical questions, of which the answer to all is yes. Okay? Am I not as free as anyone else? Am I not an apostle? Haven't I seen Jesus our Lord with my own eyes? Isn't it because of my work that you, Corinthians, belong to the Lord? If others think I am not an apostle, I certainly am to you. Why do I know this? Because you yourselves are proof that I am the Lord's apostle. I came to you. I came on this missionary journey to you. I shared the gospel with you. I spent 1.5 years with you. You're evidence. You are Jesus followers. You are evidence that I've been called by Christ. Okay? And this is my answer, verse 3 says, to those who question my authority, which has been from the beginning, and if we were studying 2 Corinthians, it gets worse, them questioning his authority. Don't we, he says, and he goes on this long sentences now of why he's not taking any pay, even though it's his right to get paid. Okay? Don't we have the right to live in your homes and share your meals? Don't we have the right to bring a believing wife or sister, could be as well, with us as the other apostles and the Lord's brothers do, and as Peter does? For is it only Barnabas and I who have to work to support ourselves? Okay, so if Paul is saying that, if we're guessing Paul is more of an upper class guy, not at the top, but somewhere in the upper, and he is saying, I'm doing manual labor, he's saying, look, I've lowered myself. I'm not too educated. I'm not too knowledgeable. I'm not too uppity to lower myself to do manual labor. Okay, so that's the idea. What soldier has to pay his own expenses? What farmer plants a vineyard and doesn't have the right to eat some of its fruit? What shepherd cares for a flock of sheep and isn't allowed to drink some of the milk? Am I expressing merely a human opinion, or does the law say something? And then he uses this passage. For the law of Moses says, you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. Was God thinking only about oxen when he said this? Wasn't he actually speaking to us? Yes, it was written for us, so that the one who plows and the one who threshes the grain might both expect a share of the harvest. We deserve a right to the harvest. We deserve to be paid. Since we have planted spiritual seed among you, aren't we entitled to a harvest of physical food and drink? I know what you're thinking. Couldn't he have said this in 3 sentences? Right? I mean, I'm reading this like, Paul, come on, bro. You could have finished this already. But he likes to keep saying it. If you support others who preach to you, shouldn't we have an even greater right to be supported? We started this church, essentially. We came and led you to Jesus, introduced you to Jesus. Wouldn't we have a greater right? But we have never used this right. We would rather put up with anything than be an obstacle to the gospel or the good news about Jesus. Paul's saying to this church, which by the way, it seems like wherever Paul lands, he's going to be an obstacle. Right? I mean, even if he was taking pay, they might use that against him. He's not taking pay because he's lowering himself. They're using that against him. Right? But he's saying, I'm trying to eliminate any obstacle there could be because the gospel of Jesus is tantamount. It's the center point. It's the most significant thing. Okay? So I'm trying to eliminate anything else. But he's not done with this example yet. Bear with us. Don't you realize that those who work in the temple get their meals from the offerings brought to the temple? And those who serve at the altar get a share of the sacrificial offerings in the same way. The Lord ordered. But he didn't, right? What he's referencing to, because if the Lord ordered it, Paul would be receiving it. Because, right, if he had, Paul's following Jesus, so he would have, but what the Lord said is the worker is worthy of his wages, right? He didn't order it, but that's the kind of the word that comes out. The Lord ordered that those who preach the good news should be supported by those who benefit from it. Okay, if you're preaching the gospel, you should get paid for that. You should be cared for by those you are shepherding, he says. Yet I've never used any of these rights. And I am now writing this to suggest that am I not writing this to suggest that I want to start now? In fact, listen to this. I would rather die than lose my right to boast about preaching without charge. Yet preaching the good news is not something I can boast about. I'm compelled by God to do it. How terrible for me if I didn't preach the good news. He's saying, God called me to preach the gospel. That is my number one focus. And if I don't want to get paid because I don't want that to get in the way. I'm doing some manual labor because I feel like that's the best way, right? He's saying, I'm just trying to find the best way to proclaim Christ. And by the way, he's compelled me to do it. He has called me to do it. So any way I can remove obstacles or barriers to the gospel, I want to do that. If I were doing this on my own initiative, I would deserve payment. But I have no choice. For God has given me his sacred trust, or this sacred trust. What then is my pay? I love this. It is the opportunity to preach the good news without charging anyone. That's why I never demand my rights when I preach the good news. Paul's saying my pay is the privilege of preaching the gospel. My pay is that God has called me to do this. My pay is that I've been compelled to do this. And so the reward for me is just watching God do God's work when I proclaim the good news. And then he makes this transition. You see, he's lost respect with the knowledgeable in the upper class in Corinth because he has lowered himself to a degree by saying he's manual labor. He's been telling them all along, I become weak, right? The weakness of the cross, it seems weak, but it's strong, right? He's been talking about this consistently, and they've wrestled with this thought. It would be, as we said, a struggle to get that in this Greco-Roman culture, right? It would be a struggle to understand it. So he says something else. Even though I'm a free man with no master, meaning no human master. He's not talking about Jesus. He's saying, I have no human master. I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Jesus. Now, when you think about those definitions, you get where he's placed himself. This guy that's probably up here somewhere has said, what I'm actually going to do is make myself, if necessary, however God calls me, to become the lowest of lows for the sake of the gospel. We'll get back to that. When I was with the Jews, he says, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, which would have been what were called God-fearers, Gentiles who were following Yahweh, when I was with them, I too lived under the law. Even though I'm not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I'm with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I still obey the law of Christ. Okay, so the gospel stays the same, and so behaviors have to change as we work through the class, right? But he's essentially saying here, I'm still being obedient to Jesus in the way I live and all these things that I do. Even when I'm moving around into these different groups, I'm still following what Christ has for me. Verse 22. When I'm with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. Paul's saying, my focus is the gospel. I've said it enough now, haven't I, this morning? The center point of the mission is the gospel. He's saying to the Corinthians, the purpose, right? Your purpose isn't the meal. It isn't doing what you want. The purpose is the gospel and what benefits everybody together. But I think about this, and I've been thinking about this practically, this idea that Paul says is I can play in any class. Boy, that seems really hard. Can I be honest about that? But did you really do that, Paul? Did you really play in each of the classes and invest yourself in that given class and live amongst that given class of people? We don't know this, right? He's given an example saying we should be willing to do that, but we don't know to the extent he did that. He's saying, I'm willing, though, to become a slave to everybody to engage the gospel of Jesus so that everybody has a chance. Essentially, what he is saying here is that I'm willing to go to people on their terms and not my own. I'm willing to put myself into their cultural dynamic, their social status, their whatever, for the sake of the gospel, not my own. I'm not asking people to come to my status, to my class, to my hierarchy. I'm actually going to go to theirs. That's not so easy as it sounds, is it? Let's be honest. It's not as easy as it sounds. Now, most of us, well, all of us were born into some social class, right? I know we like to think we don't have classes here in the U.S. We have classes, okay? And we're all born into one. Some of us might have edged up edge down, right? But normally, most of us stay pretty similar to what we were born in. We didn't leap to the top or fall to the right. We're normally somewhere where we were born. And a couple examples that came to me because this is hard, what he's saying. Right? It's because we generally relate to the people like us, don't we? Right? I know how you live, you know how I live, we know what our values are for the most part. But if I'm going to say, look, I'm going to jump to the bottom. Well, I've never experienced the bottom. I've never gone without a meal in my life. I've never been without housing in my life. I've never been voluntarily without a job. I've chosen to not have a job, but I've never not had a job because I couldn't get one. Right? I've never lived that life. So to go there, woof, I would have to live like that and be there for a long time. And I would have to go on the terms of the people I'm engaging, not trying to bring myself and all of my stuff down into it. Right? In the same way, man, I've never lived way up here. I for sure would blunder and fall and say the dumbest stuff and act stupid. Right? I can't relate. When Cindy and I served in the maternity home in Florida in 2019, we did it, and here was our thought, is we really wanted to figure out what it was like to work with the least of these. And so we had single moms, single pregnant women who wanted to keep babies, and there was no one around to help them keep babies. And so this lady had started this ministry 20 years ago. But she was from the upper middle class. And so we get there, and we are like, okay, and we lived with these ladies and their children. We lived with them, and we're like, okay, and man, we're struggling to relate because their stories are unlike anything we've ever experienced. And we don't understand. And so, but the methodology of this place is what we're going to do is we're going to take you, and we're going to try to force you up here. You're going to get to know Jesus. You're going to get to know Jesus, and we're going to try to pull you up here and teach you in, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year, all the values of this place. And if you don't make it up here, you're a failure. Those words were used. Like if you can't be up here and you can't figure out how to be up here, you're going to fail because I'm surely not going down there, was the mentality. What do you think the success rate was? I kept asking. There wasn't any. For 20 years, I got one testimony that was pretty basic. But what that taught us, right, what we learned in that is the challenge. But yet, if I'm going to minister to these young women and their children, man, I've got to be where they're at. I've got to put myself and try to understand and ask questions and love and engage. Not say, well, that doesn't work for me. Can you come up here with me? I get this better. Do you get that? And we had friends, and I want to go the other way now. We had some friends. This couple, doesn't matter. One was born into a lower class. One was born into a middle class. Married. One of them had a job that just stratospherically shot them to the top. We got along really well. We were really, really close. But the year after year after year that they lived in the stratosphere, we struggled and struggled and struggled to relate. Things they could do, the things they did. They were great givers, still are. But the people they hung out with, the things they did, were just, right? It was struggling to relate. Now, I say all of this because, right, it's easy to read that and say, oh yeah, I can do that. But man, we got to be honest. But can we? Right? It's easy to walk in and to walk into a place of someone let's say at a lower class and spend a week with them and help them and then leave and vacate for the next 51 weeks. Or to walk in once a month and say, oh yeah, I get the problem. Heck, no, we don't get the problem. Right? See that upper class in that Greco-Roman Empire? They made decisions for the lower class without ever being with them. Paul's suggesting there's another way. There's another way. The body of Christ and the gospel is so significant that I have to live with folks to understand their needs. I have to be with them to understand how to serve them. I have to create community with folks to understand what real needs are and how to engage. But he says the one thing that doesn't change is the gospel. Jesus is still the same regardless of where you're at. The good news is still the same regardless of where you're at. And I think about how through history missionaries went and said, you need to dress like us, you need to look like us, you need to adapt our cultures. And then recent years, however long, we're like, that didn't work so well. Maybe we need to engage in a very different way as we go proclaim the gospel. Paul finishes this with this amazing sports analogy that would have totally registered with Corinthians. Sports were a big deal. And he says, don't you realize that in a race, everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. Right? Could you imagine? I mean, think of your favorite professional athlete if they never, shot thousands of shots a day, or the way they train for football, or whatever your sport is, right? If they're like, practice, forget it. I don't need it anymore, man. I don't need to train. Matter of fact, I don't even need to train my lungs because I've arrived, right? No, right? Elite athletes train year-round to do these things that we've put up here, unfortunately, but to do these things, right? They train year-round. It never stops, the training. Paul's like, they're disciplined, or maybe they're purposeful. They have a purpose. They want to be the best at what they do. They do it to win a prize that's going to fade away. Oof. We see that in our culture, right? Boy, a lot of money and stuff flows to these high-trained athletes. But we do what we do for something that's eternal. So wouldn't we train and be purposeful for something that's eternal versus something that isn't? So I run with purpose, he says. I love this. In every step. Not every other step. Not only on Sunday steps. Take Saturday steps off. Every step I run with purpose. I'm not just shadow boxing. I'm not just playing around, just having like a little fun over here. I'm purposeful in all that I do. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. I fear, like, if I'm not up to par, if I'm not up to speed, if I am not prepared at every moment, God might want to use me. Maybe God doesn't want to use me anymore. I get the analogy, right? Those of us who've done sports, we get the analogy. Those of us who train hard for music get the analogy. Those of us who trade hard for our craft, we get the analogy, right? But even in that, I'm wondering how, as I've wrestled with this week and this idea of moving between classes and meeting people on their terms, I'm wondering how hard do I really train to be purposeful at every step of the way? Am I that purposeful that every step God gives me on this earth, which could end today, could end tomorrow, it might be another 10, 20, 30 years, who knows, but in every step, do I desire to be as prayed up, worshiped up, as close to God as I can be, because I never know at any given moment when the gospel will need to be lived or shared. Church, even though Paul used way too many words for me, right? This is like my wife makes fun of the novels I read. She's like, oh, they're all really short sentences. You don't like detail. Right. Just get to the point, right? Paul could have ended this after verse 4. I've been like, I get it. Let's move on. But he kept going and going and going to drive the point home. The gospel is center to all that we do. And again, if I believe Jesus is coming back at any moment, like this church might, right, that makes it all the more significant. But I want us to be honest in this, right? I want us to be honest about our own purpose. That's one. But two, let's be honest about this ability to be who we need to be for anybody. Let's be honest about that. Let's be honest that when it's needed, let's be honest about how God might use us in that and what He might be calling us to sacrifice in that. Because some of us, He might be calling us to sacrifice, to go to folks, to go someplace, right? To engage people who are at a different place than us. Are we prepared for that? See, I think it's one thing. I get Paul saying, I'm compelled to preach the gospel. I get that. God has called me to preach the gospel. God has called some people to go to other countries. God has called some to start ministries here locally. But don't you think you have not been called? We all have been called to preach the gospel. We all have been called through our lives and our words to share the good news of Jesus. So Paul isn't just speaking to those called to some specific position, because Paul looks at it as all of us are called. We all share in this together as followers of Jesus. So as we walk through this week, and you talk to the Lord in your prayer time or along your own walk or while you're driving or however you really engage God the best, right? Just throw it out there. God, how could I be more purposeful in what you're asking of me at this point in time in history, at this point in time in my life? Because, by the way, that ebbs and flows, right? That's changed for me throughout my life. Even at any church I've pastored, it changes what my purpose is. And so ask God, what is my purpose right now? How could I be more purposeful? But then really be honest and say, God, I know the folks I'm most comfortable with. Are you calling me to go to a different group of folks? Are you wanting me to go to someone on their terms, not on my own? Are you wanting me to go up, go down, whatever it might be, because there is a person or a couple people or a group of people that you believe I'm the guy or the gal that would be best to share the gospel of Christ? And I think we'll be amazed at how God wants to use us, in whom he wants us to go to, where he wants us to go, and why he wants us to go. Right? It's easy to stay with everybody we like and know and relate the best to. But man, I feel like the best ministry is when God throws us out of the comfort, takes us to a place where we're going to be struggling and have to learn and grow and trust him. For what? For the sake of the gospel. We'll spend a few moments in prayer as Betsy and the guys prepare to come and lead us in a couple songs, and really just start talking to God now about your purpose and about where he wants you and what that might look like. Lord, we want to be a group of people who are purposeful about our lives as individuals and are purposeful about our lives as a body. We don't want to be willy-nilly. We want to be where you want us, engaging how you want us, with the people you want us. May we be open to what that might look like, to where that might be, to whom that might be with. Lord, so as we walk this week with you, another day, another week, we're just open to what you have for us as individuals and as the body. We just want to receive you and receive those you want us to love. And we look forward to the challenges and the struggles, whatever it might be, because we get to do it for the sake of the gospel, for your sake.